Prologue. I heard every word. That is what I need the world to understand before the veil comes off, and the gasping starts, and the story becomes about my face instead of his cruelty. I heard every word Alpha King Cassian Blackthorne said about me during the 3 months between our engagement and our wedding. Every joke, every complaint, every casual, laughing dismissal shared with his court, while I stood on the other side of doors and walls, and the particular thin silk of bridal veils that men assume are soundproof because they have never been inside one. I heard him tell Lord Damian Cross at the engagement feast, "They sent me the ugly one. The Farzan family has 3 daughters, and they sent me the one even their own court calls plain." I heard him tell his advisor, Lady Vivienne Marchetti, "At least the alliance secures the eastern ports. I will simply avoid looking at her during state functions." I heard him tell his guards, men who would later stand outside my chambers, that he hoped the bedroom would be dark enough that he could imagine someone else. 3 months of this. 3 months of a man who had never seen my face constructing an entire mythology about my ugliness based on a portrait that, I would later discover, had been deliberately altered. The Farzan tradition of the veiled bride was ancient. The Omega remained veiled from the engagement until the wedding ceremony's completion, when the Alpha lifted the veil and saw his bride's face for the first time. It was meant to ensure that the bond was formed through conversation, scent, and spiritual compatibility rather than physical appearance. In practice, it meant that Cassian Blackthorne spent 3 months talking to, about, and around a woman whose face he had never seen, basing his cruelty entirely on a single portrait that Lady Vivienne had arranged to have painted. A portrait that bore no resemblance to me. Because Vivienne Marchetti, who had been Cassian's companion for 2 years and intended to remain so, had commissioned the ugliest possible rendering of the Farzan bride to ensure the king would despise his wife before he ever met her. The portrait showed a woman with a crooked jaw, pocked skin, and dull eyes. It was a masterpiece of sabotage, and Cassian, who could have waited to form his own judgment, had accepted it as fact and spent 3 months being publicly, joyfully cruel about the appearance of a woman who was standing close enough to hear every word through a piece of silk. The wedding ceremony was held in the great hall of Blackthorne Palace, before 400 guests. I stood at the altar in the traditional Farzan bridal gown, white silk embroidered with gold thread, the veil covering my face in layers so fine they obscured features, while allowing me to see the room perfectly. I could see the faces in the assembly. I could see the pity from some, the amusement from others, the particular malicious satisfaction on Lady Vivienne's face in the front row. I could see Cassian standing across from me, handsome and miserable, performing duty with the resignation of a man who believed he was sacrificing his aesthetic standards for Eastern port access. The elder spoke the binding words. The assembly witnessed. And then came the moment that the Farzan tradition builds toward. The lifting of the veil, when the Alpha sees his Omega for the first time, and the bond begins. Cassian reached for the veil with the enthusiasm of a man reaching for a tax document. His fingers caught the silk. He lifted it, and the great hall went silent. 400 people. Silent. Because beneath the veil, the woman that Cassian Blackthorne had spent 3 months calling ugly was not what anyone expected. And the look on his face, the shock, the confusion, the dawning, horrified realization that he had been spectacularly, publicly, catastrophically wrong, would become the most talked about moment in Blackthorne history. But the story is not about my face. The story is about what he said before he saw it. And the fact that a beautiful face does not erase 3 months of cruelty. It only illuminates who was cruel. The veil lifted. The hall gasped. The king's face shattered. But the bride was not thinking about her beauty. She was thinking about the 3 months of cruelty she had heard through silk. And she was thinking, the veil did not hide me from you. It revealed you to me. Chapter 1. My name is Anahita Farzan. I was 26 years old, the second daughter of the Farzan dynasty of the Eastern Territories, and I was, though this is the least important thing about me, and the only thing this story will be remembered for, considered by those who had actually seen my face to be beautiful, not modestly attractive, not pleasant-looking, the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet, that painters requested to study, that my mother Parisa said was both a gift and a weapon depending on who was looking. Dark hair that fell to my waist, golden brown skin, eyes that my father said held centuries, and the particular symmetry of features that human beings are biologically programmed to respond to whether they want to or not. None of this mattered. I want to say that clearly at the beginning, before the veil lifts and the story becomes about gasping, and beauty reveals and the satisfying spectacle of a cruel man being proven wrong. My face did not matter. What mattered was that Cassian Blackthorn decided I was ugly before he met me, and he treated me accordingly, not with the quiet disappointment of a man accepting an arranged match he found unappealing, but with the public, performative cruelty of a man who wanted his court to know that his bride was beneath him. He turned my supposed ugliness into entertainment, into bonding material for his inner circle, into 3 months of jokes that 400 people heard, repeated, and normalized until the entire Blackthorn court was comfortable mocking a veiled woman who could not defend herself, because the veil that protected her tradition also silenced her response. The Farzan veiling tradition existed precisely to prevent this. My grandmother, Zara, had explained it to me when I was young. We veil because the world judges women by their faces before it listens to their words. The veil removes the face from the negotiation. It forces the Alpha to know the Omega through her mind, her spirit, her scent. When the veil lifts, the bond is already formed on foundations that beauty cannot build, and ugliness cannot destroy. It was a beautiful principle. It assumed good faith from the Alpha, the willingness to engage with a veiled bride as a person, rather than an aesthetic object. Cassian had not engaged in good faith. He had accepted a fraudulent portrait, formed his judgment, and spent 3 months treating me as a punchline. The tradition that was meant to protect me had been weaponized against me, and the woman who weaponized it was sitting in the front row at my wedding, smiling. Lady Vivian Marchetti was 31, beta, stunningly beautiful in the sharp-edged way that comes from strategic self-presentation, rather than natural ease. She had been Cassian's unofficial companion for 2 years, not his mate, not his consort, but the woman who occupied the space beside him at dinners and functions, with a possessive comfort that everyone in court recognized, and no one challenged. When the Farzan alliance was proposed, and a bride was required, Vivian had volunteered to manage the preparations. She had intercepted the portrait, commissioned a replacement, fed Cassian a fiction about Farzan ugliness that was so consistent and detailed that by the time I arrived, veiled, the entire court believed the king was being martyred by an unfortunate face. Vivian had not just lied. She had constructed a narrative so thorough that it became the court's reality. And she had done it while smiling at me through my veil, welcoming me to the palace, managing my wardrobe, and overseeing my comfort with the attentive efficiency of a woman who wanted me close enough to control and miserable enough to eventually leave. Lady Vivian commissioned a fake portrait. The king built 3 months of cruelty on a lie. The court turned the bride into a punchline. And beneath the veil, the woman they mocked heard everything. Every joke, every insult, every laugh, and waited for the moment that would reveal not her face, but their character. Chapter 2. The 3 months between engagement and wedding were an education in the psychology of cruelty. Not the dramatic, deliberate cruelty of a villain, the casual, ambient cruelty of a social system that had been given permission to dehumanize someone. Cassian's public complaints about his bride's appearance functioned as a license. When the king mocked the ugly Omega, the court understood that mocking was acceptable. When the king joked about avoiding her face, the court understood that avoidance was policy. The hierarchy worked like water flowing downhill. Cruelty originated at the top and cascaded through every level, until the kitchen staff were gossiping about the plain bride, and the stable hands were making jokes about veils, and the entire palace had aligned itself around the shared entertainment of a woman's supposed ugliness. I observed this from inside the veil with the analytical detachment of a woman who had studied political systems at the Farzan Royal Academy, and recognized a power structure being weaponized in real time. The cruelty was not random. It was architectural. It served specific functions within the court hierarchy, bonding the inner circle through shared contempt, establishing Cassian's dominance by demonstrating his willingness to publicly diminish his wife, and insulating Vivian's position by ensuring the bride arrived at the wedding already despised. Every joke was a brick in a wall designed to isolate me before the veil even lifted. The psychological impact was precise and cumulative. I was not weak. I had been raised in the Farzan court, educated in diplomacy and resilience, trained to navigate hostile environments. But 3 months of hearing the man you are bound to marry describe you as ugly to anyone who will listen is a particular kind of erosion. It does not break you in one blow. It wears you down in increments, each overheard comment removing a thin layer of the self-worth you arrived with, until the person standing at the altar is thinner than the person who accepted the engagement. Not broken, diminished, made smaller by the constant, dripping, socially sanctioned reminder that your value in this place is determined by a face no one has seen and a portrait no one questioned. I almost left. Twice. The first time was after I heard Cassian tell Vivienne that he planned to maintain separate chambers permanently, so he would not have to wake beside the ugly wife. The second time was after a lady-in-waiting, a young beta named Elise, who did not know I was in the next room, described me to another servant as the poor creature behind the veil and laughed. Both times I packed my things. Both times I stopped. Not because I was brave or strategic or playing a long game. Because my mother Parisa had traveled with me to the Blackthorn territory and was staying in the diplomatic quarters, and leaving would mean the collapse of the alliance, the humiliation of the Farzan dynasty, and the end of the Eastern port agreements that my father had spent 3 years negotiating. I stayed for my family. Not for the king who mocked me. Not for the court that treated me as a joke. For the parents who needed this alliance and the territory that depended on it. My mother knew. Not the specifics. I shielded her from the worst. But the atmosphere. She could feel the court's hostility the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. On the night before the wedding, she sat with me in my chambers and held my hands and said, in Farsi, "Tomorrow the veil lifts, and they will see what we have always known, that you are beautiful. But listen to me, Anahita. Your beauty is not the lesson. The lesson is what they said before they saw it. Remember every word, because those words are who they are. The face they see tomorrow will not change who they chose to be when they thought you were ugly. Do not let beauty become an apology for cruelty. Hold them accountable for who they were in the dark. 3 months of cruelty, an entire court system aligned around mocking a veiled woman, and her mother's words the night before. Do not let beauty become an apology for cruelty. Hold them accountable for who they were in the dark." Chapter 3. The moment the veil lifted became the most dissected 4 seconds in Blackthorn court history. Every witness would later describe it differently. The angle of light, the sound of silk, the specific quality of silence that fell over 400 people simultaneously. But the essential facts were these. Cassian Blackthorn reached for the veil with the mechanical obligation of a man completing a contractual requirement. He lifted it, and the woman beneath was so far from the portrait he had been shown, so far from the ugliness he had spent 3 months broadcasting to his court, that his brain could not process the discrepancy fast enough to control his face. The shock was total. His hands froze on the veil. His lips parted. His eyes, blue, sharp, accustomed to controlling every micro-expression, went wide with an involuntary response that 400 people witnessed and would never forget. He stared at me, at the face he had called ugly for 3 months, at the woman he had joked about avoiding, at the bride he had publicly, repeatedly, enthusiastically humiliated, based on a portrait that was, he was now understanding with devastating clarity, a lie. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the hall erupted, not with the polite murmur of a standard veil lifting, with gasps. Audible, uncontrolled gasps from 400 people who had spent 3 months building a mental image of the ugly bride, and were now confronting the reality that the image was fiction. I watched his face through those 4 seconds, and I catalogued every expression the way my mother told me to. Remember every word, remember every look, hold them accountable. I saw the shock. I saw the confusion. I saw the rapid recalculation as his brain attempted to reconcile 3 months of ugly jokes with the face in front of him. And then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Desire. Instant, involuntary, physical desire, replacing the contempt that had lived in his expression for 3 months with an attraction so obvious that every person in the hall could read it. He wanted me now. Now that the face was acceptable. Now that the ugliness was revealed as a lie. 3 months of cruelty, reversed in 4 seconds by a face that met his standards. I leaned close to him, close enough that only he could hear. Close enough that the 400 witnesses would see intimacy rather than what it actually was. And I whispered, I heard every word, Cassian. Every joke, every complaint, every laugh. For 3 months, through the veil. And the fact that my face is not what you expected does not change what you said when you believed it was. He went white. The color drained from his face so completely that Lord Cross, standing nearby, later said he thought the king was about to faint. Then the elder pronounced us bonded, and the hall applauded, and Cassian Blackthorne stood beside his new wife with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the ground beneath him was not ground at all, but a thin crust over a chasm, and every step he had taken for 3 months had been widening the crack. I smiled for the hall. The practiced, gracious, diplomatic smile of a Farzan-trained bride at her wedding ceremony. I smiled while the court approached with congratulations that were actually shock. The ladies who had called me poor creature now stammering compliments. The lords who had laughed at the king's jokes now studying me with the particular recalculation of men reassessing an asset. I smiled while Vivienne Marchetti stood frozen in the front row, her face a mask of something between fury and terror, watching the fiction she had built collapse in real time. I smiled through all of it, because smiling was what the Farzan bride did at her wedding, and because the smile concealed the thing I was actually feeling, which was not triumph or satisfaction, but a cold, settled fury that had been building for 3 months, and was now, with the veil removed, ready to be expressed. The veil lifted. The hall gasped. The king's contempt turned to desire in 4 seconds. And the bride leaned in and whispered, I heard every word. His face went white. Because beauty does not erase cruelty. It only removes the excuse. Chapter 4. The wedding night did not happen. I locked the door of my chambers with a calm that surprised even me and told Cassian through the wood that he could sleep in the quarters he had planned to maintain permanently, so he would not have to wake beside the ugly wife. His own words returned to him through a locked door. He stood outside for 40 minutes. I know because I sat on the other side and listened to him breathe. He did not knock, did not demand, did not invoke his rights as king or husband. He simply stood there, breathing, and then he walked away. It was the first thing he had done in 3 months that suggested the possibility of decency. The following morning, I requested a formal audience, not as his wife, as the Farzan dynasty's representative. I dressed in Farzan court attire rather than the Blackthorne wardrobe Vivienne had selected, arranged my hair in the traditional style my mother wore, and presented myself in the council chamber where Cassian sat with his advisors, Lord Cross, Commander Sable Okafor, and Lady Vivienne herself. I had requested Vivienne's presence specifically. The trap had been set for 3 months. It was time to spring it. I brought the portrait. The fraudulent one. The painting Vivienne had commissioned to ensure the king despised his bride sight, unseen. I set it on the council table beside a second portrait, the real one, painted by the Farzan court's official artist, which I had carried with me from the Eastern Territories because my mother, who understood political sabotage the way generals understand battlefields, had suspected from the beginning that the Blackthorne court's hostility was engineered rather than organic. 2 portraits, I said. The one on the left was presented to the king as my likeness. The one on the right is my actual likeness, painted by Master Kaveh of the Farzan Academy, authenticated and sealed by the Eastern Court. I looked at Vivienne. Someone replaced the original with a forgery. Someone who had access to the diplomatic correspondence, who managed the pre-wedding preparations, and who had a personal interest in ensuring the king found his bride repulsive. The room went very quiet. Vivienne's face was perfectly composed. She was skilled at performance, but her scent, which Cassian's enhanced alpha senses could read like text, betrayed her. I watched him turn to her slowly. "Vivienne," he said. His voice held the particular flatness of a man who was processing a betrayal so layered he could not yet feel the full scope of it. "Did you commission this portrait?" She denied it. Of course she did. Denial is the first defense of the architect, whose building is collapsing. But Commander Okafor, whom I had contacted privately the day after my arrival with my mother's suspicions, had spent 3 months quietly investigating. The evidence was comprehensive. Financial records showing Vivienne's payment to a painter in the capital, correspondence between Vivienne and the painter specifying the alterations required, and testimony from a servant who had witnessed the original portrait being replaced. Vivienne had constructed her sabotage with intelligence. She had not constructed it with enough intelligence to survive a Farzan mother's suspicion and a military commander's investigation. Cassian dismissed Vivienne from the council, from the palace, from his life. The dismissal was swift, absolute, and performed with a fury that I recognized as partially genuine and partially theatrical. The anger of a man who had been manipulated, but also the anger of a man who was using Vivienne's betrayal to avoid confronting his own, because Vivienne had lied about the portrait. But Cassian had chosen to be cruel. No one forced him to spend 3 months mocking his veiled bride. No one required him to make her ugliness a court entertainment. Vivienne provided the fiction, but Cassian authored the cruelty, and the distinction between the person who lit the match and the person who chose to burn the house down was the distinction I needed him to understand. After Vivienne was removed, I turned to Cassian. The portrait was a lie, but the 3 months were real. Every word you said about me was a choice you made, not because of Vivienne, because of who you are when you believe a woman is ugly. You did not mock me because you were deceived. You mocked me because you believed mockery was an acceptable response to a woman's appearance. The portrait gave you a target. The cruelty was yours. He did not argue, did not defend. He sat in his council chair with the ruins of Vivienne's deception around him and the much larger ruins of his own behavior settling into the silence, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The veil had lifted, and what it revealed was not my face. It was his. Vivienne's fraud was exposed with 2 portraits and a commander's investigation. But the bride did not let the king hide behind the betrayal. The portrait was a lie. The cruelty was yours. The veil did not reveal her face. It revealed his character. Chapter 5. I gave him conditions for remaining in the marriage. Not out of forgiveness, out of pragmatism. The alliance was too important to dissolve, and my family had invested too much for me to walk away without attempting to salvage something structural from the wreckage. But the conditions were not gentle. First, a public apology. Not to me, to the court. Every person who had participated in 3 months of mockery needed to hear the king acknowledge that the mockery was wrong. Not because the bride turned out to be beautiful, because mocking anyone's appearance was beneath the dignity of the crown, regardless of what they looked like. The apology must not reference my beauty. It must address the cruelty. Second, the court culture that had enabled the mockery would be formally restructured. The hierarchy that allowed the king's contempt to cascade into systemic humiliation would be examined and reformed. Any member of the court who had participated in the mockery, repeating jokes, spreading gossip, contributing to the isolation of the veiled bride, would be required to undergo formal accountability review. Not punishment. Accountability. The recognition that their behavior had been part of a system designed to destroy a person, and that the system needed to change. Third, he would learn who I was. Not my face, he could see that now, and I was bitterly aware that the face was doing the persuading that my personhood had failed to do for 3 months. He would learn my mind, my history, my languages, my education, my opinions. He would learn the woman who had been behind the veil the entire time, the woman he could have known if he had engaged with the Farzan tradition in good faith instead of accepting a fraudulent portrait and using it as a license for cruelty. The public apology was delivered the following week. Cassian stood before the assembled court and said words that I had not written for him. I had refused to script the apology because the point was not performance, but genuine reckoning. He was imperfect. He stumbled. He said, "For 3 months I mocked a woman I had never seen based on a portrait I never verified. That is my failure. not Lady Vivian's. She provided the lie, but I chose to be cruel. I chose to make my bride's supposed appearance a source of entertainment. I chose to create an environment where 400 people felt comfortable laughing at a veiled woman who could not respond. The fact that my wife is beautiful does not make this better. If anything, it makes it worse, because it reveals that my compassion is conditional on attractiveness, and that is not compassion at all. It is vanity wearing a mask. I am sorry. Not because I was wrong about her face, because I was wrong about what matters. He paused. What matters is that behind the veil was a woman who speaks 4 languages, holds a degree in diplomatic strategy, and organized the Farzan trade agreements that will benefit this territory for the next decade. I did not know any of this because I did not ask. I was too busy being cruel about a face I had never seen to learn the mind that was listening to every word. That is a failure of character, not of information, and it will not happen again. The hall was silent. Not the shocked silence of the veil lifting, a heavier silence. The silence of 400 people being confronted with their own complicity. The ladies who had called me poor creature. The lords who had laughed. The servants who had gossiped. Every person who had participated in the cascade of cruelty that originated with a king's contempt and flowed downhill through the entire social structure. They were all in that hall, and the apology was for all of them, not just from Cassian. To them. A mirror held up to a court that had spent 3 months entertaining itself with a woman's dehumanization, and was now being asked to look at what it had done. His apology did not mention her beauty. It addressed the cruelty. He told 400 people that compassion conditional on attractiveness is not compassion. It is vanity wearing a mask. The court heard itself reflected back. The silence was not shock. It was recognition. Chapter 6. Learning me took time. Not because I was complicated, though I was, but because Cassian had to unlearn the fiction before he could learn the reality. The ugly bride had been a character in a story he told himself, and that character had to be dismantled before he could see the person who had been inside it. I made him work. Not cruelly. I did not mirror his cruelty back at him, because becoming the thing that wounded you is not healing. It is replication. But I did not make it easy. I answered his questions with the same directness my mother had modeled. Honest, unsparing, without the social padding that palace conversations typically wrapped around difficult truths. He learned that I spoke Farsi, Arabic, French, and English. That I had studied diplomatic strategy and had authored the trade framework that made the eastern ports valuable, the very ports he had cited as the only consolation for marrying an ugly wife. He learned that I played the tar, a Persian stringed instrument, and that music was how I processed difficult emotions. He learned that I had heard him through the veil every time, every joke, every complaint, and that the woman he had been mocking for 3 months had been standing close enough to touch, listening, cataloging, and quietly breaking in ways that would take longer to heal than the 3 months it had taken to inflict. The romance, when it came, was not the fairy tale the court wanted it to be. The court wanted beauty redeems all. They wanted the king to see her face and fall in love, and for the 3 months to be retroactively justified by a happy ending. I refused to provide that narrative. What I provided instead was harder and realer. The slow, earned, uncomfortable process of a man confronting his own shallowness and choosing to build something different on the other side of it. Cassian courted me as if we were starting from scratch, because we were. The 3 months of cruelty had been a first draft, and first drafts must be discarded entirely before a better version can be written. 8 months after the wedding, on a winter evening when the palace was quiet and we were sitting in the library that had become our shared space, he said, "I love you." I set down my book. "I know," I said, "but I need you to understand what you love, because if the answer is my face, we have a problem." "I love the woman behind the veil," he said, "the one I should have been trying to know for 3 months instead of mocking. The diplomat, the musician, the person who sat through my cruelty and still stayed for her family's sake. I love that you held me accountable when the veil lifted instead of letting beauty excuse the ugliness of my behavior. I love that you forced a public apology that did not mention your appearance. I love that you are harder than a fairy tale and more honest than any court I have ever governed." And I love that you gave me conditions instead of forgiveness, because conditions can be met, and forgiveness would have been too easy for someone who needed to earn it. I looked at him across our library. This man who had spent 3 months being terrible, and 8 months being transformed by the consequences of it. And I said, I love you too. Not because you changed, because you understood why changing was necessary. The distinction matters. Epilogue. 3 years later. Our daughter was born, with her father's blue eyes, and my dark hair, and a temperament so fierce that my mother said she was Farzan through and through. We named her Zara, after my grandmother, who had explained the veil tradition, the tradition that was meant to protect, and that had instead become the vehicle for the most painful and most transformative experience of both our lives. Cassian held her in the delivery room and wept, and I let him weep because some tears are necessary, and because the man weeping over his daughter was not the man who had mocked his veiled bride. He was the man who had been broken open by his own cruelty and rebuilt by the woman who refused to let beauty excuse it. The fraudulent portrait hung in the palace gallery, not hidden, displayed. Cassian had insisted over my initial objections that it remain visible as a permanent reminder. This is who I was, he said. A man who accepted a lie because it was easier to mock than to question. The portrait stays so that I never forget what casual cruelty looks like, and so that everyone who walks past it remembers what this court was willing to do to a woman based on a painting no one bothered to verify. Beside it hung the real portrait, Master Kava's authentic work. The 2 paintings side by side, the lie and the truth, the sabotage and the reality. A visual record of how a court conspired to destroy a woman, and how the woman refused to be destroyed. Vivienne Marchetti had disappeared into exile in a territory that would accept her, which turned out to be very few once the story spread. The woman who had commissioned a fraudulent portrait to sabotage a royal marriage found that the social structures she had manipulated so skillfully no longer had space for her. Courts that valued loyalty recoiled. Courts that valued beauty, the same superficial currency Vivienne had traded in, found her beautiful face insufficient compensation for her proven capacity for destruction. She became, in the end, a cautionary tale about the weapons that beauty can be made into, and the damage those weapons do to everyone they touch, including the person who wields them. One evening, Cassian found me in the library, reading to Zara, who was 2 and had opinions about every book that were expressed loudly and with great conviction. He sat beside us and watched his daughter grab my hair and demand more story with the imperious certainty of a child who had never been told she was anything less than extraordinary. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "If she grows up and someone calls her ugly, you will do nothing," I said, "because I will have already raised her to know that her worth is not determined by anyone's assessment of her face. And because the lesson of our story is not that the ugly bride was actually beautiful. The lesson is that it should not have mattered." He nodded slowly. "You are right. The lesson is that it should not have mattered." I kissed his forehead. "That is the only lesson," I said. "And our daughter will learn it. Not from a veil or a portrait or a 4-second gasp in a crowded hall. From a mother who heard every word spoken in the dark and chose to hold the world accountable for what it said when it thought no one beautiful was listening. The Alpha King thought he married an ugly Omega. The veil lifted, and the hall gasped. But the bride did not care about the gasping. She cared about the 3 months before it. Because beauty did not redeem his cruelty. It exposed it. And the lesson was never that the ugly bride was beautiful. The lesson was that it should not have mattered.